The morning sun spilled across the quiet diner parking lot, where a frail old man in a weathered military jacket steadied a tray of coffee cups with trembling hands. His name was Frank, a man whose silence carried the weight of forgotten wars. Nearby, a sleek car door slammed and out stepped Jake, a young influencer with restless ambition flickering in his eyes and a phone clutched like a weapon of validation. He grinned into the lens, whispering to his unseen audience about a prank that would blow up online. Frank turned just as Jake deliberately brushed against him, sending coffee splattering across the asphalt. The old man flinched, whispering an apology he didn't owe. Jake laughed, loud and cruel, his camera capturing the moment with merciless precision. For an instant, the world stood still, the hiss of the coffee, the whisper of the wind, the tension heavy enough to silence breath. Across the lot, a few figures sat astride rumbling motorcycles, their expressions unreadable behind dark glasses. They saw everything, yet said nothing. Frank bent to gather the fallen cups, dignity flickering like a candle in a storm. Jake's laughter echoed as he walked away, his victory hollow, his audience unseen. But the biker's gaze followed him, calm and unblinking, like a storm waiting for its cue. And though no words were spoken, something had already begun to shift. Frank lived by quiet routines. The steady scrape of a broom across the diner floor, the soft clink of coffee cups, the murmured greetings that never asked too much. He had learned long ago that peace came not from being noticed, but from being useful. His weathered hands moved with patience, his faded jacket stitched with memories too heavy to share. When Maya, the young waitress, teased him about working too hard, he smiled faintly and replied, "Keeps the ghost busy." She didn't press further. She'd seen the faraway look in his eyes whenever sirens wailed or laughter turned cruel. Across town, Jake replayed the video he'd filmed of Frank. The slap, the stumble, the shocked silence. Each replay brought more comments, more likes, more proof that the world was watching. Yet, beneath the thrill of attention, a faint unease began to settle in his chest, a discomfort he buried beneath new hashtags and forced grins. To his followers, he was confident and untouchable. To himself, he was still chasing something nameless. By evening, the clip had spread beyond Jake's control. At the diner, Maya scrolled through the comments, anger knotting in her stomach. Frank only sighed, wiping the counter with quiet resignation. Outside, engines rumbled, a group of bikers arriving, their faces grim beneath the fading light. As they stepped off their bikes, the air thickened with unspoken intent, and though Frank did not yet look up, he could already feel the storm gathering just beyond the glass. The video spread like wildfire, igniting outrage and mockery in equal measure. Some laughed at the old man's stumble, while others demanded justice for his humiliation. Frank avoided the chatter, spending his days polishing the diner's counter as though order could erase disgrace. When Maya gently mentioned the video, he only replied, "Let them talk. I've lived through worse storms." Yet his eyes, usually calm, flickered with quiet hurt. Each customer glance fell heavier than words, a silent reminder of a cruelty he hadn't deserved. Jake, meanwhile, basked in the attention. The surge of followers dulled his guilt, but only for a while. Late at night, he scrolled through the comments, some praising, others condemning, each one carving a little deeper into his certainty. For the first time, the applause sounded hollow. Still, pride kept him posting. He couldn't admit he'd crossed a line. At the diner, the bikers' presence grew more frequent. They sat together in silence, watching Frank with a reverence that unsettled even Maya. One evening, Tom, their leader, calm and broad-shouldered, placed a hand on Frank's arm. "You shouldn't have to swallow disrespect," he said quietly. Frank shook his head. Violence teaches nothing. But Tom's eyes held a different lesson, one about dignity, not revenge. Outside, as the bikers mounted their bikes and engines roared, Maya sensed that something was about to change. The air felt charged, like the moment before thunder, an unseen promise that cruelty would not go unanswered. Jake returned to the diner the next morning, his camera already recording as he strutted across the parking lot. The confidence on his face was forced now, a mask cracking beneath the weight of restless guilt. He planned another prank, something light he told himself. Something harmless to wash away the stain of yesterday's cruelty. But as he stepped through the door, the laughter and casual noise of the diner faded into stillness. Every table was full, every pair of eyes fixed on him. At the center sat Frank, quietly stirring his coffee, surrounded by the same group of bikers who had watched in silence the day before. Tom rose from his seat, his leather vest creaking softly, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Morning. Star boy," he said evenly. Jake froze. The phone in his hand suddenly felt heavier than any camera ever had. He tried to grin, to turn the tension into content. "Hey, no hard feelings, right? It was just a joke." Frank looked up then, calm, steady, and impossibly kind. "Son," he said, his voice low but resonant, "the world's full of people trying to be seen. But what matters most is why they want to be." Tom gestured to the empty seat across from Frank. "Sit." The single word carried no threat, yet Jake obeyed. Around him, the bikers said nothing. Their silence was a mirror reflecting every cruel laugh, every thoughtless act he performed for strangers online. Frank told him about service, about loss, about the price of dignity. He didn't preach or scold. He simply spoke, each word measured, grounded in truth. Jake's hands trembled as the realization took root. The followers he chased would never stand beside him in silence like this. They would never look him in the eye with the respect that Frank had somehow managed to offer even after humiliation. Shame burned through him, raw, cleansing, unbearable. Tom finally reached for Jake's phone, unlocked it, and scrolled through the cruel video. Without anger, he deleted it and placed the phone back on the table. "Start over," he said simply. Jake nodded, eyes wet, unable to speak. As he left the diner, the morning sun struck his face, and for the first time in years, he lowered his camera and saw the world instead of his reflection. Days passed quietly after that morning, yet the echoes of what had happened lingered like a bruise beneath the town's routine. Frank continued his work at the diner, calm and unassuming, but something softer had returned to his eyes, a light that came from being seen not as a victim, but as a man restored. Maya noticed it first when he chuckled at her teasing, a sound she hadn't heard in months. The bikers still visited, not to watch over him now, but to share coffee, stories, and a quiet camaraderie born from respect. Jake came back one afternoon, not with a camera, but with a bouquet of simple wildflowers wrapped in brown paper. The doorbell chimed, and every head turned as he stepped inside. There was no swagger, no performance, only the uneasy sincerity of someone who had finally learned the weight of his own actions. He approached Frank's booth and placed the flowers gently on the table. "I can't undo it," he said, voice low, "but I can start making things right." Frank regarded him for a long moment before nodding. "You already have," he replied, and gestured to the empty seat across from him. Jake sat down, his posture uncertain but open, as Maya poured him a cup of coffee. No one clapped or offered forgiveness out loud. The quiet itself was a redemption. The video was gone, but in its place grew something more enduring, a lesson lived rather than spoken. In the following weeks, Jake began volunteering at the local veterans shelter. Sometimes he filmed, but never for views, only to share stories of strength and survival that he'd once ignored. His audience dwindled, but the few who stayed wrote words that mattered. The bikers, too, invited him to ride with them on weekends. The roar of the engines a steady rhythm that drowned out the noise of regret. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Jake and Frank stood outside the diner, watching the world fade into amber light. "You taught me something," Jake murmured. Frank smiled faintly. "No, son," he said, eyes on the horizon. "You learned it yourself." The moment hung between them, quiet, redemptive, and complete, yet carrying the unspoken promise that this was only the beginning. The town settled back into its quiet rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted. The diner, once just a stop for hurried travelers, now held the warmth of an unspoken story that had touched everyone who walked through its door. Frank sat by the window most mornings, his cup of coffee steaming gently in his hands as the sun stretched across the counter. The lines on his face seemed softer now, no longer carved by years of endurance, but eased by a quiet sense of peace. People greeted him differently, no longer out of pity, but from genuine respect. Jake visited often, always without his phone. He no longer sought to capture moments. He tried instead to live them. Sometimes he helped Maya serve customers. Sometimes he just listened to Frank talk about the world before screens and hashtags. The silence between them no longer carried shame, but understanding. Redemption had not erased his past, but had rewritten his purpose. One evening, the bikers returned, their engines low and steady as thunder in the distance. They didn't stay long, just enough to share a few smiles, a few firm handshakes, and a nod toward Jake that spoke of acceptance. As they rode off into the twilight, Frank watched them disappear down the road, a faint smile curling beneath his breath. Later, when the diner closed and the neon sign flickered in the window, Jake asked quietly, "Do you ever think people can really change?" Frank looked at him, his gaze steady. "People don't change," he said. "They remember who they were supposed to be." Outside, the last light of the day melted into darkness, wrapping the diner in a calm, golden stillness. The world kept spinning, indifferent yet somehow gentler. A man who had once chased attention had learned the power of humility. A veteran who had once been invisible now stood as a symbol of quiet strength. As the screen faded to black, a final line lingered, white against the dark, simple yet profound. Kindness costs nothing, but it can change everything. And in that silence, the story didn't end. It continued in every small act of grace left behind, waiting for someone else to notice and choose better.